Coming up, it's the NBA Finals that the Brooklyn Nets helped build. We break down the matchup between Luka and Tatum. A legacy situation is on the line, plus other key players to watch if you want to see Brooklyn continue to build a better roster going forward. We dive in coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. He's Doug Norrie. I'm Adam Armbrecht. We thank you, as always, for making us your first listen of the day. We are 100% free on all those great platforms. And let you know, today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. And Doug, terms apply to being one of the NBA greats, and both Luka Doncic and Jayson Tatum need to win a championship to cement that legacy.
Oh, it's legacy talk time, and it starts with the finals, baby. We're finally here. It feels like it took like weeks, right? Like it's so much time off. It's just, I don't know, like it felt like there was just like, there was no basketball, but it's just a really, really weird feeling. Allows too much time for narratives. One of those narratives, obviously, being a superstar has to win a title or they're quote unquote not good enough, and then
That's
the
right.
whole landscape changes. I will say there's a great tweet out there from old friend of the podcast, Matt Brooks, who's now working with the Denver Nuggets.
Yes.
And he had a great one that it's hard to describe, but he just says society, if basketball was talked about as a team sport instead of like a single player legacy. And it's just like one of those like technological utopias from like Tomorrowland or whatever it is. And it's so great. And it's so correct too, because basketball is this team sport where the team needs really one of these 1A superstars to actually reach the next level. So you get caught a little bit in between about just sort of team building and legacy. But this one lines up really well because we're going to get a first-time NBA champion out of the two, and who will then cement their legacy for good, right, as like a championship level player. And then someone else is going to have, ongoing question marks, even though really in the grand scheme of things, there aren't any, I wouldn't say.
No, it's interesting, too, because so the other narrative here, and we're going to get to the Brooklyn Nets, kind of some role players here you can take a look at, guys that are going to be impending free agents, maybe some trade opportunities. As we know, Nets trying to get back into that first round of the draft later this month. But it is interesting, too, that the other narrative is around how this is more critical for Jayson Tatum and for the Boston Celtics than it is for Luka Doncic. Well, because it's his first time now getting into these finals, looking at it and saying you were fifth seed, you get to the NBA Finals, maybe somewhat surprisingly. Kyrie has only been there for a season and a half. It's your first time in the playoffs with Kyrie Irving. All these things that suggest, so there's no real pressure on you to go and win it right now. The flip side being Boston and seemingly coming up short, and Tatum sometimes being the poster child for that. I find it interesting that if Jayson Tatum doesn't win, that conversation around him will explode. It will be massive because of how many times we've seen them be on the precipice. For Luka, I think it'll still be there. But I also think that it's more important for Luka to go win this one now. You're in the Western Conference where you could turn around next year, even though it feels like these playoffs have shown how good this team can be. You could still be a fourth or fifth seed. You could still not make the Western Conference Finals and not find yourself with this opportunity for another 2 or 3 seasons. So simply by conference, I look at Luka and say, hey, if it matters for you to start the narrative building now, go win one now, because I can easily tell you that Boston will be in the Eastern Conference Finals for the next decade as it stands right now until other teams make some moves in the East.
Yeah, I mean, the math is pretty simple. It's much easier to not make the finals than to make the finals, right? So just from like a purely mathematical standpoint, I think like it's a pretty safe bet. Like if we were all betting right now, would you be say, are either of these teams going to make the finals next year? You just bet no, like if it's even money, right? And it's only just a testament to how hard it is to actually get here. And then if you want to go one step above that and say, will either of them win? We just go double no, right? Because it's just even harder to actually win one. And you can go from the Denver Nuggets.
What do you think the odds are on both teams win next year?
Both teams winning? Yeah, might be a little out there. But, don't look too far away from, the Denver Nuggets win it last year. And you're saying, I mean, are we going to be seeing this 3 years in a row? And it's like, nope, didn't even make the Western Conference Finals. Yep. It's just hard. And they have arguably the best player in basketball.
Yep.
And so it's just really, really hard to get to this point, which is why I personally am always like sort of all these anti-narratives because it's just, I find it to be silly and just kind of short-sighted around, oh, unless you win one, then you're somehow not worthy. It's very, very silly, but it's mostly speaking to the astronomical odds at which you have to sort of live at to even make the finals / win the finals. It's just really, really hard.
Of course.
And so for me, like legacy wise, there won't be a lack of an imprint after these finals. I know for some fans it will. Now it could change the landscape of the NBA, which is important for the Nets, because anytime it doesn't happen, then everyone gets a little itchy around, if this is the team they want to be on. And that's actually sort of the world the Nets have to live in right now, because they kind of need someone else to get a little, hey, grass might be greener scenario with their current teams in order for them to improve.
And isn't it also, I mean, it's also too, I mentioned Jayson Tatum. Sometimes he's had some small playoff performances or small performances in the NBA finals, but it's also relative to how you perform on an individual level, let alone team level. But if Jayson Tatum comes out and puts up 40 points a night for 7-game series and loses, it's going to be really hard for you to look at Boston and say anything other than, okay, so what do we need to adjust so that Jayson Tatum has a better supporting cast, which now feels hard when you look at how good their supporting cast is. Likewise for Luka, this is probably the one side of it where you can look at the Dallas Mavericks and say, hey, listen, we have a rookie in Derek Lively. Yes, we brought over Gafford, but there's certain elements, PJ Washington, there's certain components to this where you go, this was like the phase 2 after getting Kyrie at the deadline a year prior. This was phase 2, and phase 3 is what's the next thing that we do here? Who else do we add into this mix? So you actually can, I think, paint a path for the Dallas Mavericks where you say, whatever the result, and it seems impossible, by the way, between these two players, you can see a world where Jayson Tatum has small games in the finals because we've seen it. I can never imagine Luka Doncic having a bad game. Maybe period, and I know he has them, but I just can't see it. No matter what happens in these NBA finals, I guarantee you Luka Doncic averages somewhere close to 35 points a night if the narrative demands it. Does that feel right to you in between these two players that like Luka is the set it and forget it? Jayson Tatum does seem to have, I'm not even knocking him, he's one of the best players in the game, but he does seem to have a little bit of, it can come and go for him where you may look back in a game 3, in a game 4 and say, oh, if Tatum was on tonight, if he could have found his shot tonight, if he maybe attacked a little bit more rather than settling for certain shots, we would be talking about Boston taking that game as opposed to losing it.
I mean, it's just, I think to me, it just comes down to Dallas has the best player and Boston has the best team. Right. Yeah. And I think right. Like to me, it's, maybe that's sidewinding your question a little bit, but
it is. That's fine.
But it's mostly just like Boston can withstand that from Tatum because they're a much better team. Like they can withstand the down performance because they have Jaylen Brown, Staps, and all these other and like better
can
guys.
Absorb Luka Doncic epic performances because they have the full team that can rebound against that. Right?
Totally. I mean, Luka's clearly the best player. It's like not a debate. It's not. He's awesome. He's the reason they're in the finals. He's at worst like top 3 player in basketball at this point. And I mean, you could probably start making cases for like him to be the best, right? And so it's just because he's like he can solve every problem. He can control the game and sort of like bend the game to his will in a way that many other players cannot, and most other players can't. And when you can do that, you just are an NBA cheat code. So we got more to talk about here, and we'll get into that in a second. But there's like more ways to probably slice this Dallas and Boston series. There's more ways that probably could impact the Nets going forward. We'll get into that here in a second. First, going to tell you about our friends over at Gametime. Look, we're heading into the NBA Finals now, but you might be heading into a summer where you're looking to go to a game, looking to go to a concert, looking to go to the theater. This is where you have to go to Gametime to make sure you're getting the best deals on tickets and the best ticketing app around. Like they got the tickets for the NBA Finals right now, but this might be a little bit far afield of where we're looking here in the New York area. They also got a ton of stuff like got Dodgers at Yankees coming up on Friday, starting at $64. Copa America, Chile versus Argentina at MetLife. Little pricier at $186, but you're still going to grab the best deal over there on Gametime. That's because Gametime makes buying tickets as easy as possible. They got last minute deals, saving you up to 60% off the, like I said, the sports, the concerts, the comedy, the theater. They got flash deals, zone deals, all in pricing. You're going to be able to see exactly what you're going to see from your seat on the app before you even buy the tickets. So just no wondering about what's going to happen when you sit down in that seat. All you have to do right now to get started, you download the Gametime app, you create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNBA. You're going to get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Look, create an account, Redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Download Gametime today. Last-minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed.
All right, so as we continue today's Locked On Nets episode, we also ask you the question, are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day, and you have to turn down the volume with all that, we call it shouting? Make the switch over to Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports today is also going to be giving you the analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube, and it's free on the Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. You know, it's your team, and it's every day. Now, there's two things here. One, I want to talk about some of the sub players inside of this and how it can connect back to the Brooklyn Nets. And on the back end of this episode, we'll give some predictions. What do we think is going to happen ultimately in these NBA finals? But beyond the Luka and Tatum matchup, there's also, we can go to Kyrie Irving and Jaylen Brown. We can do those matchups here as well. I think it's going to be just a fascinating series to watch from a matchup and from an adjustment standpoint, because Boston probably has more things to go to, more options to play with. But from a Brooklyn Nets standpoint, we should all be watching one Joshua Green. Josh Green, to me, Doug, poison pill contract a couple of years ago got set up where everyone was like, boy, what are you going to do with this guy? It's going to be a real problem, the money that he's going to make. Now, all of a sudden, you turn around. He's on the books this year for $12.6 million. And going forward, the number is not that prohibitive. If we're thinking about ways that the Brooklyn Nets can improve their roster this offseason, and a team in Dallas that'll say after these finals, regardless of result, let's continue to bolster ourselves, the Dorian Finney-Smith reunion to Dallas is very much an option. Would you be open to, as we talked about last episode, what's more valuable, picks or players? A 1-to-1 Dorian Finney-Smith for Josh Green swap, if that was something that Dallas was looking to do to bring back a veteran experienced 3-and-D wing to their roster?
Yeah, it always gets tricky with these teams that reach the next level, right? Because they have to be, one, a lot more incentivized to try to keep things together, because but it also becomes a lot harder because everyone plays well and then everyone gets paid more. Green doesn't necessarily fall into that category, but where he becomes a weird spot is like how far you see in that contract going out, especially if they need to start paying other guys in the short term quicker, where if DFS comes off the salary cap a little easier, and then you free up the money in the short term. Now, Green's contract could be looked at as like a nice bargain. It does go out to like $14 million over the next couple years. And so it's like, oh, could you, because he's one of these guys, it's like, hey, change of scenery with a bigger role. Could you see him being a much better player? And he's just never going to get that chance here with Luka and Kyrie. Right. And so like the value is kind of wasted. Like these are the scenarios that Nets have to be sort of like really keyed into, and they're hard because sometimes it's hard to realize exactly what a guy is. Like you never know what a guy is. It goes both ways. You sometimes never know what a guy like this truly is when he has to play with Kyrie and Luka. Not their fault, but it's like they're just going to control the ball a lot. So are we ever going to really know? Then you get other guys whose games get totally elevated because by playing, like Derek Jones Jr. by playing with, or PJ Washington. Hey, you get to play with those guys. Well, now you're awesome. Right. And so, it just kind of, it differs a little bit depending on archetype. But I think Green is one of those guys who will get some run here. And I do think there probably could be a market for him. And he kind of fits the bill of a guy that Dallas could swap out to get like something short term, free up a little money down the road. And it might look bad because he is kind of on a favorable contract. So it's weird to like look into the finals at a guy like this, but I think you're right. Like these are the kinds of guys the Nets need to target.
Yeah, and you look back at the last series against Minnesota, where at most he played 25 minutes, but also had a 13-minute performance in there as well. He's only taking 3 or 4 shots a game. They're all coming from beyond the arc, right? So you know the mold that he's sitting there in, and you look and talk about never having a point scoring performance over 5. So now you say that and then go, and the Brooklyn Nets should want to get a look at this guy if they can. But to your point about the Dorian Finney-Smith contract, it's twofold. One, Brooklyn Nets want to get value out of that, as we know. But I think your point about Dallas is really important. Hey, we can get back in Dorian Finney-Smith, and he has the player option obviously in there as well, but they could always figure something out. It seems like the longing to have him be back there and his desire to be back in that area is also important. So maybe it ends up being a pretty team-friendly situation where they keep him around. And for Josh Green, who was playing over the course of the season, averaging over 26 minutes a night, there's something that you can see here of shrinking the rotation, expanding the highest player minutes, and Josh Green keeps getting a little bit more marginalized. So
Well,
If
yeah,
I was the
part of that
Brooklyn,
was sort of what happened in the trade. Like bringing him, he was starting for a while, and then they make the moves at the deadline, and
right.
guys get a little healthier, and now all of a sudden, like he's just not starting anymore. And so, like that's part of that was just I just wanted that a little context,
Yeah,
like sort
yeah.
of what was happening with those minutes.
And by the way, those minutes getting reduced is also, and so it's the idea of, well, we went out and added pieces. We added pieces ahead of you in the pecking order. And if you're the Brooklyn Nets and you look at that north of $14 million over the next couple of years going forward, okay, you have money coming off the books. You can go make moves. And we've talked about this with Nicholas Claxton and his contract, or what the options are going to be, the Cam Thomas extension. This is the perfect window. 23 years old. He'll be 24 years old next year. He fits right into the timeline to say, okay, take a chance on a guy. And I think this is probably more about what does Dallas think about it and how do they approach their offseason as opposed to Brooklyn. Because for me, while getting back into the draft in any capacity is always what you want the goal to be, if I got the call and I'm Sean Marks and it's, hey, we want Dorian Finney-Smith, we'll give you Josh Green, we can debate about a second-round pick or something getting thrown in here, but basically it's 1-to-1, I would sign off on that instantly if I was the Brooklyn Nets and bring in Josh Green for the next 2+ seasons.
Yeah, and I think again, like when you're 23 years old, the Nets, I know it's looking more and more like they're going to push toward a 2025 timeline with a super clean cap. They need to have cheap money on the books whenever possible so they can keep their cap clean. I mean, this would be the reason they might not think about this, right? Is like,
Sure.
hey, we don't want to tie up money to something we're not sure about. But it's so funny because I just don't know how this offseason is going to go. We get reports that like Detroit could be really, really in on Nick Claxton, and that could push the asking price way up. And all of a sudden, like they might find themselves even with some money to spend this offseason. Like there's a world where like they're in that mode. I mean, simply missing out on Claxton would put them in that mode, right?
Yes.
Like where they would have to be like they'd have to start thinking about like sort of getting some other money possibly on the books. So it's all and especially if you can like trade in the bird rights, like there's other things that happen here that there's a domino effect that could happen pretty quickly with the Nets that might be out of their control. It mostly is around Claxton, but that would necessitate them having to get A, younger, hopefully, and B, like NBA at least ready players whenever possible. And Green at least checks those boxes. So like a weird guy to talk about, going into the finals because we're talking about like Luka and Tatum. But again, like if you're at the Nets perspective, like these have to be the guy. This is why we always like talked in last year, like, hey, let's talk about guys like Jonathan Kuminga. We talked about Isaac Okoro in the past. Like we mentioned Josh Giddey. Like I know these aren't like always the best names to always hear, but change of scenery guys who have already shown they can at least play at the NBA level should be like at the forefront of the Nets' mind if it doesn't go a certain other way for them.
We're going to talk about predictions here coming up in a second, but one final note about both of these teams in the finals. They are second apron teams, wouldn't you know it, as you would expect sometimes with these type of players and salaries, which means they cannot aggregate any contracts in a trade. So players cannot be aggregated. So there are restrictions around these types of teams that already have big money on the books, that have already been living in the aprons, and all of a sudden get restricted. And that's some of the new CBA rules, which make it harder to hold on to certain players or make you to maybe force you, to have to make difficult decisions on guys you wouldn't hate holding on to a little bit longer. Coming up here in a second, what do we think is going to happen in the finals? And ultimately, are there any other takeaways for the Brooklyn Nets to learn as we watch two teams go at it starting Thursday night? We'll get into that in just one moment.
All right, before we get to that, tell you about our friends over at Prize Picks. Look, with Prize Picks, you can turn $10 into $1,000 in a single game. Just watching your favorite sports all summer long, starting with the NBA Finals. You can make a Prize Picks lineup in as few as 60 seconds. You just to pick more or less than 2 to 6 players' stat projections, and you're locked in. When we're saying stat projections, you're just going more or less on, let's say, hoops. It's, points, rebounds, blocks, assists, steals. It's all there for you over on Prize Picks. If you want to get in on the NBA Finals action, you can go more on the 0.5 point. Am I even seeing this right? 0.5 points with Jayson Tatum. It's a limited time, so you're going to want to make sure you get in on that. Got all kinds of cool stuff happening with the Demons and Goblins over there on Prize Picks. Look, Prize Picks, they want you to get in on this. More than 0.5 when it comes to Jayson Tatum. Absolutely forget about it. It's not just NBA either. MLB, they got WNBA coming along this summer as well. Esports in on the action. Go check out Prize Picks today. You're going to download the Prize Picks app and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Once again, download the Prize Picks app. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy.
All right, so as we tie a bow on the Locked On Nets episode today, talking about the NBA Finals, talking about some surprising names for the Brooklyn Nets, maybe to keep an eye on as these finals unfold. Do you think there's anything to the idea too? I just wanted to put this out there very quickly. The Derek White situation for Boston is also interesting, making $19.5 million final year going on his contract. Like do you think that Boston will be influenced by the results of these finals in any high enough level way where they make a somewhat surprising decision? We know a couple years ago it's Marcus Smart, but now they have Drew Holiday and he's under contract. I bring up Derek White only because it's going to be expiring, and that means that you have to either make a commitment decision with him or try to pivot away and rebuild a little bit, and you do have a different backcourt than you did, 3 seasons ago as far as what players and where their value lies.
I don't see how they couldn't bring him back. I mean, I think Boston could actually lose this and still be like, hey, we're just going to run it back. I think they're that good. And this team is that good. Even if they lost to Dallas, I think they're going to win. But let's just say they lost to Dallas, I think that they would. How could they even make it better? I get that even if they lost, the team was so good in the regular season. They absolutely stomped on other teams. They were able to rest guys all the time because the team just won every single night. Like, no one ever got on Boston's case for strategically resting guys because they would still go out and win the games. They steamrolled their way to
always the salve when we rested half our starters. Sure, but we're still winning all the games.
Yeah, we still won. So what do you want us to do? Great. Yeah. Okay, they got to rest and we still won. So
I'm so good. I'm sorry.
I know that they've steamrolled through the East and there was a lot of context around that. I think they'd still be here even if everyone was healthy. Might have been a little harder, but the team is just really, really good. And remember, it's like, they didn't have to face their team's best players. Their arguably second best player wasn't playing in Kristaps Porzingis, and they still kind of had no problem getting to the finals here. So I think you see this team basically the same as last year with White. They got Tatum coming up. I know the Nets fans are probably sitting there waiting. It's like, hey, would Tatum ever hit real free agency here?
No.
That's like one of those like pipe dreams. I guess maybe there's some world where it happens, but I just don't see how it could. Like the guy, and so because he's one of these 2025 free agents where you just kind of cross your fingers, but he just doesn't really fit into like that KD Kyrie mode of maybe something looks a little better somewhere else. Not when he has this level of run through Boston already. So yeah, I know you started with Derek White, but I guess it's a long way to say I think no matter what happens, this team looks pretty similar.
No, and the Porzingis note is really important here, right? We're going to see it's like now we're going to see another different version of the playoff Boston Celtics because he didn't play at all in that last series. So you're talking about waited a long time throughout these playoffs to get him back. You know what the team looks like with him on the court, but to your point, win or lose, well, we brought him in, right? We have Drew Holiday that we brought over as well. We still have Derek White. We'll re-up him. When you go back and look at that core of players, Jaylen Brown, Jayson Tatum, Porzingis, Drew Holiday, Derek White, why would you do anything probably at this point than say, we'll just keep trying. We'll just keep trying until someone else comes in and definitively tells us in the Eastern Conference we're not good enough to be going to Eastern Conference Finals and have a shot at the finals.
Dude, they were so much better than every team this year. There's a reason they're massive favorites in the finals, right? They are. I think the best odds you can get is like them winning in 5 or something like that, right? Like that, or like the worst odds. Where it comes to just what's the most likely outcome. They crushed teams this year. It goes a little understated because they didn't have a Jokic or like they didn't have any. Let me put it this way: they didn't have any MVP candidates, and so I think sometimes that gets because of the way the media narratives work around teams and players. Aforementioned, like what we mentioned at the very beginning, those other players get a little more lead time just because that's a little more interesting maybe than talking about the full team. They had an 11.4 point differential, over plus 11.4 average point differential over the course of the season. The next closest in the Eastern Conference was 4.6. That's the difference. So the difference between 1 and 2 in the Eastern Conference was the difference of 2 and 12 in the Eastern Conference. Like that's how much of bigger it was actually the difference of 1-to-1 of the Knicks to the Nets. As the point differential, as the Celtics to the Knicks was the same point differential as the Knicks all the way down to the Nets. And by the way, it carries mostly over the Western Conference as well. So this team was so good that they're probably at this point weirdly underrated, except for betting markets where they're like massive favorites.
And oh, by the way, when you're in the Eastern Conference, I think that's what also kind of waters down your accomplishment of the season. Well, you played in the East, just in case you're wondering, 23-7 against the West this year.
Yeah, and they killed everybody. They killed everybody.
That's what I mean.
Like, they were just awesome. And by the way, I did this every single night. It wasn't every night. Most nights, a lot of nights, they just had a starter that didn't play. Like, right. they did this strategically over the course of the season. I mean, White played a lot, but a lot of these guys just sat games out back-to-backs. They just didn't have to play them. Didn't matter. They still stomped everybody.
And that's a little bit of what this team has learned maybe over the last few years and coming up short a little bit. So you find a way to navigate that regular season. So when it comes to the playoffs and you happen to lose Porzingis for a while, guess what? It's not going to slow us down. We're still going to be in the finals. Before we get out the door, Doug, it sounds like you're going to be taking the Boston Celtics in this series. How long do you think that it goes, though, with Luka being the best? You know, what are we looking at here in terms of ultimately longevity of this NBA Finals after a 63-day layoff?
Yeah, so I just because of the way it shakes out, I think that, like, the most likely outcome, like I said, from a betting market is, I think, Boston in 5. It's mostly because that game goes back to Boston at that point, right? It's like, why, you want to say 6, but it's like that game heads back to Dallas, right? So I'll just say Boston in 7 because I think Dallas puts up a fight, but I feel pretty confident that it's over before then. But if I had to just set it, I would say 7. And if Kristaps is healthy, I think it could easily be 5. I just think that's, like, underrated at this point. I know, like, the Luka thing is great and he's amazing. I don't know. What do you think, real quick? Because I have one more quick point about this.
Well, the hard part is, like, if you think that Dallas, Kyrie Irving, obviously a little bit of a revenge narrative here. We'll talk about it as the series goes along. Didn't have a great stint in Boston, or at least the exit from there anyway. So, and we know how good Kyrie can be. The idea that Dallas has a shot to win this thing, it becomes really hard to say, wow, boy, in the 7th game in Boston. So then you say, okay, so can Dallas win it in 6? Like, that's where I think you have a harder time, creating that path for Dallas to win it. I'll take Dallas in the series just because best player. I'll take best player. And if you stacked up with experience and success in the finals, Kyrie Irving's shown capable of doing that. More than anything, it's going to come down to this cast of others. PJ Washington, Derek Lively Jr., talking about, listen, even Daniel Gafford, right? Like, what can they do when Porzingis gets back out there on the floor? How are they going to deal with those kind of battles? It's not this is a heart vote, not a head vote.
All right, we're gonna get out of here.
Get out of here.
Real quick. Actually, I was the one that said we could get out of here. Just real quick, one word. Who are you rooting for in the series?
I'm rooting for the Dallas Mavericks. I'm rooting for Luka. Like, I'm rooting for Luka to get his first one. I think he's the best player in the league, arguably now, and you want to see the best player be getting some rings.
All right. I'm not going to pick one because I root for the Nets. All right, we're going to get out of here. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On. Locked On Nets.
Garbage. That's not right.
Right, Locked On. Make sure you're Locked On Nets over on YouTube. We crested over 7,000 subscribers here today. You can be part of the group that gets in on that action as well. So make sure you subscribe to Locked On Nets over on YouTube.
Ladies and gentlemen, a very special closeout quote. Yours is the best Nets podcast out there because you two are balanced, honest, unafraid, considerate of different perspectives, imaginative and funny, along with authentic Nets fans vibes, and 2 of the greatest living poets. Why that is LBL for Life 1.
One of the all-time great poets. We're back again. One of the all-time great poets calling us one of the all-time great poets. We're in meta poet territory here. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.
Basketball. Yeah.